This is the lecture on intelligence given on Thursday, February 11th. When we look at intelligence, it's really difficult to try to understand how we can measure it. Do we measure it in creativity? Do we measure it in grades? Do we measure it in reading and writing? Do we measure it in math? It's very difficult, and so therefore, like personality, intelligence is a very dynamic subject to try to define. But a few people have tried to figure out how to measure personality and come up with some theories about personality itself. Louis Thurstone was the first guy to discuss intelligence. Thurstone developed an idea that said we had 7 primary mental abilities, and you can see them all listed here: word fluency, spatial ability, logical reasoning, memory, perceptual speed, how quickly you answer the questions. And to measure his students, he gave them 8 different assessments on each one of these 7 abilities. So that would be 56 different exams to really define what someone's intelligence was. Thurstone was the first guy to come up with any sort of idea about intelligence itself. After that came Charles Spearman. Spearman was kind of we should say it was a rival of Thurstone. And yet, so with Spearman, what he did is he gave one type of test, and that test measured what he called the G factor, and that's general intelligence. Spearman's exams use factor analysis. If you forget what that is, go see the personality lecture, the second one, to identify and kind of combine all the answers that a person gave into one general score. But additionally, Spearman also said that there was the S factor, which referred to specific intelligences. And that reflected, better abilities in one subject versus another. And again, he could use factor analysis on his exams to try to identify both the G factor and the S factor. In the 1980s, see, we're not that far away, Howard Gardner developed his idea of multiple intelligences. Gardner believed that there were 8 distinct types of intelligence, and each one is reflected in individuals by what they're good at and what they're skilled at. Linguistic intelligence was having lots of knowledge and skill in using words and writing and vocabulary. Logical skills was cause and effect relationship, critical thinking, math skills. Spatial skills were people who could visualize the space itself and could visualize different ideas about how to use space. So, like, for example, architects. Musical intelligence would be anybody who is strong with it, has a strong musical ability. Additionally, also people who understand things like rhythms and patterns. Body kinesthetic intelligence refers to people who could use their bodies very well. So, like, for example, athletes or dancers. Interpersonal intelligence were people who are really good at connecting with others, human resources, and employee relations. Whereas intrapersonal were people who were very good at reflecting on their own abilities and their own skills. And then you had naturalist intelligence. Naturalist intelligence are people who had a connection with the natural world. So this isn't just things like forest rangers, but also things like farmers and botanists. Finally, in the 90s, Robert Sternberg developed his triarchic theory of intelligence, in which he said that there were 3 distinct types of skills that made up a person's intelligence. First was analytical skills. Analytical skills were problem solving, cause and effect relationship, getting answers correct in which there was only one right answer. Creative intelligence was demonstrated in innovation, the ability to adapt to new situation and generate new ideas. And then practical intelligence was the ability to adapt to the context and realism of everyday life, looking at solutions that work in real life and not just in theory. These four theories are the primary theories of intelligence. But we also have emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is basically the ability to understand emotions and use them in ways that are useful and efficient. There are four parts to emotional intelligence. There's perceiving emotions, in which we recognize emotions in faces and in stories and identify our own emotions. We have understanding emotions, in which we predict them about how they might change and how they might blend. We have managing emotions, knowing how to express them in varied situations and manage others' emotions. And then using emotions to develop or adapt to creative thinking. When we talk about intelligence, we can also talk about intelligence over the lifespan. Crystallized intelligence is intelligence in which we use our knowledge to and refer to our knowledge base as we try to come up with solutions. Whereas fluid intelligence is more intelligence that has to do with the ability to problem solve when given something that we have no knowledge of. When we're very young, our crystallized intelligence is medium to low because we just haven't had enough life experience to develop that sort of knowledge. On the other hand, our fluid intelligence is quite high because we're able to adapt to new situations and understand these situations around us because we are new and adaptable. As we age, however, our crystallized intelligence tends to grow with more experience, while our fluid intelligence tends to drop as some of our mental faculties tend to suffer a little bit with age. Finally, we look at something like nature and nurture. And certainly when we look at intelligence, intelligence is absolutely genetically inherited. If you have smart parents, you are very likely to be smart yourself. But nurture plays a key role too. If you had two people and they grew up with one of them only with the same parents, let's say they were twins that were separated at birth, and one parent just let them watch TV all day or play video games all day, and the other ones had them read books and study and really work hard in school, most likely the one that worked hard in school is going to be of higher intelligence because of that nurture aspect. So while intelligence is genetically inherited, how we use it and how we foster that intelligence definitely plays a role. The second part of this lecture looks at assessments and how assessments can measure intelligence. The first intelligence assessment ever given, was the Stanford Binet test. Alfred Binet was a teacher in France, and he wanted to figure out a way to separate his students into various classes based on abilities. So he developed a assessment based on Louis Thurstone's ideas, in which students would have questions from varying different mental abilities, but then took the idea of Spearman's G factor and said that would provide one distinct score. That test grew in popularity as it was successful. And soon after and later, Stanford University was able to adopt and alter a version or create a version of Alfred Binet's test that was a little bit more geared towards people who were living here. The first time they tried it, people had issues with some of the cultural questions. But ultimately, the Stanford Binet test became what was known as the IQ test, or intelligence quotient. IQ testing was the primary form of testing in the United States and around most of the world throughout the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, even into the 80s. These days, the IQ test is a little outdated, but there is a modern version, which I'll mention in just a moment. When we talk about tests themselves, there are two main types of assessments: aptitude and achievement tests. Aptitude tests are how much your answers can predict future success. I'm sorry. Let me rephrase. Aptitude tests show how much you have learned about a specific subject. So, like, for example, the AP test is an aptitude test, while achievement tests demonstrate what you might be able to do later. So, for example, the SAT is a version of the achievement test. Today, the modern version of the IQ test is the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which tries to eliminate all forms of bias within the exam and really has become the modern version of the IQ test. Now, one thing that we see with testing is something called the Flynn effect. And in the Flynn effect, it basically says that this occurs when exam scores on a whole, on average, increase over time. So, for example, IQ scores or WAIS scores have definitely increased throughout the general population throughout a long period of time. Now, a lot of times, testing has been used to create tracking in school, where students are put into higher level classes or lower level classes, but it can kind of create problems too. On some cases, it does help because students are grouped with varying abilities, and so there's never going to be someone that's too far behind or too far ahead. But on the other hand, it also can create problems. Like, for example, if a student is put in a low-level class, they are very likely to stop trying because they look around them and they know that they're in the low-level class. Or students who are in a high-level class also may stop trying because they're like, why do I need to try anymore? I'm already in this high class with all the smart people. When we talk about assessments themselves, we have to look at two things: reliability and validity. Validity can be divided is basically, is the test valid? So does it cover what it needs to cover? There are 5 types of validity. Content validity is when the exam specifically measures a certain type of content, like, for example, the AP exam. This is a very easy measurement. Does the exam actually test what was learned in the class? Construct validity is a little bit different. Construct validity is like content validity, but for topics that are not so measurable, that are more dynamic, like intelligence or like personality. So personality tests and intelligence tests need to be construct valid. Face validity is when we look at something and try to see if at face value, does it look like what it should cover? And this usually can be like, look at something for 10 seconds, look at a couple of the questions and see, yeah, I feel like this does cover what it's supposed to cover. Predictive validity refers to exams that attempt to predict future success. Like, for example, the SAT has a very high predictive validity about a person's performance in college. And then finally, the criterion validity is the validity in which we measure how much one exam score would create a similar exam score on a similar exam. So, for example, if you took the SAT and you got a certain score and then got a similar score on the ACT, although the numbers don't match up, then we could say that it is criterionally valid. But exams also need to be reliable too. Reliability means that we're going to get the same results if we take it a number of times. There are 4 types of reliability. Split half reliability is when we look at the exam, we split it in half, and we see that the scores in one half are also reflective of the scores in the other half of the exam. Test-retest reliability is when we take an exam and then we take it again. Now, a lot of times our retrieval information and our memory processes are going to allow us to probably do a little bit better on that retest. An alternate form reliability is when we have 2 types of an exam or 2 forms of an exam that covers the same content. Like, for example, exam A or exam B on the AP test. And then finally, we have inter-rater reliability. And inter-rater reliability is when one person's subjective opinion will also be similar or the same as another person's subjective opinion. So, like, for example, when you have people looking at writing samples. Ultimately, when we talk about intelligence assessment, though, what do we know? Well, we know that For in gender, females tend to do better with things like spelling, verbal skills, emotional intelligence, and memory, while males tend to do better in spatial ability, complex math, but are also more in the highs and lows, whereas females tend to group more around the middle. So you have some very high scores with males, but you also have some very low scores with males. For gender, we can see that evolution plays a role too. And this certainly can explain why we might have certain better abilities. So, like, for example, females in cave people days needed to remember which plants were poisonous and which weren't, as they were tended to be more of the gatherers. They also had to have a high emotional intelligence because they were the primary nurturers. Whereas men had to have high spatial ability if they had to track an animal and then be able to return to the tribe. But today, these things can also play a role in our intelligence, the experience of it as well. So this demonstrates a little bit more of why males tend to do a little bit more with video games, whereas women tend to do, especially in lower grades, tend to do much better in things like spelling tests. What about race and ethnicity? Well, certainly there are some differences between different races, but does that mean that one race is smarter than another? Absolutely not. The big contributing factor to a higher intelligence score for one race versus another is absolutely just the environment. When most kids out of most areas start taking intelligence exams at the very lowest levels, their scores tend to be equal. However, as they go through elementary, middle school, and high school, the students who live in a higher socioeconomic class tend to do better and their intelligence scores tend to be higher, whereas those who tend to do worse or live in lower socioeconomic class tend to do a little bit worse as they go through middle school and high school. But here's the thing, and certainly race is often very much tied to socioeconomic class due to higher poverty or lower poverty. But here's the thing. There are some studies that have been done that have tracked students from when they were in kindergarten through high school and even through college. And they found that those who then went to college and got the same opportunities or similar opportunities that were given to the students from higher socioeconomic classes showed that within less than a year, that intelligence number went back to even. So what we know is that while certainly at times one race will seem to have a higher intelligence than another, it's really just environmental effects that are causing this. Finally, let's go back to the AP test. Not the AP test, the IQ test. I'm sorry. And with the IQ test, there's always been the question of, is it culturally biased? Well, maybe, depending on how you actually qualify what bias is. If you qualify bias based on experience, like, for example, when the IQ test was given very heavily, minority students tended to do a little bit worse because sometimes there were questions about things like a saucer, which is another type of plate that people have that you put a teacup on. Yet, if you live in a lower socioeconomic class, then you tend to only have one set of plates and not others' plates for different occasions. And so, because of that, students from those areas were getting that question wrong. And that does show that experientially biased or bias based on experience, absolutely the IQ test was. And that's one of the changes that are made from the IQ test to the WAIS. However, if you're talking about something like predictive validity, which the IQ test is definitely designed to do, is to predict future success, then we can say that no, it is not biased. That and also certainly with some of the other like content validity and construct validity, we can say that no, it is not biased because this is an exam that does test on what it's supposed to, which is a person's different abilities surrounding intelligence. And then finally, we get to something called the stereotype threat. And the stereotype threat basically says that when students of a certain group, when people of a certain group are told that they do worse on an exam, they end up doing worse on the exam. And that's because they second guess themselves and they think about, oh, I'm going to be another one of these people that does badly and things like that. And what we see is that, they did a really famous study where they had a group of women split into two groups. One group was told nothing before they took the exam. The other group was told that women tended to score lower on this exam than men. And what they found is that the ones who were told that they scored lower ended up scoring lower. And certainly, this is an example of what we call a stereotype threat. And this is the end of the lecture.